Welcome to Rachel Carlson's dissertation defense. Her dissertation is Climate Resilience in the Coastal Zone, Coral Survival and Regrowth in the Hawaiian Archipelago. Over the next hour, we get a chance to hear from her about the work she's done over these last several years. Really exciting work based principally in Hawaii. With that in mind, I want to start by acknowledging that Stanford sits on ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone land that has been and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people, and that Rachel's work happened, of course, on lands and waters that are the territory of Native Hawaiian peoples, and also keen to acknowledge the continued value of those lands to them. So we acknowledge, honor, and make visible our relationship to those Native peoples as we hear about the work that Rachel's been doing here today. We have ballots that dropped on the floor. We'll get those later. So my name is Jim Leap. I'm on the faculty of the Woods Institute for the Environment, where you are now sitting, and co-director of the Center for Ocean Solutions. I serve as university chair for this defense. Let me just quickly introduce the other members of the committee. One of Rachel's two co-advisors is Larry Crowder, who is the Edward Ricketts Provostial Professor and a member of the new Oceans Department. Second co-advisor is Greg Asner. Incredibly on screen. He actually flew here from Hawaii on Sunday only to learn that Mauna Loa was erupting for the first time in 40 years at some hazard to his facilities and his community in Hawaii. And so he turned around and flew back. So far, so good. And he is with us virtually. Yep. The two other members of the committee, Fiorenza Micheli, who is the Packard Professor of Marine Sciences, chair of the new Oceans Department, and most importantly, co-director of the Center for Ocean Solutions. Daly, who's the Bing Professor of, what is it, Environmental Science. and most importantly, the founder of the Natural Capital Project. So with that, let me turn it over to Larry to introduce Rachel. As you know, she will present. We'll have time for questions from the audience here and from people online before the hour is over. Larry, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, welcome everyone. And I don't know about the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources. It's like the national top of the line interdisciplinary program in all fields of environmental studies and management. And so the students we get are really unique students in the sense that they were already committed to an interdisciplinary kind of approach. And Rachel is a special case, so I need to tell a little bit more about her background. Bachelor's degree in English, in civil and environmental engineering, another master's degree in international politics and diplomacy. That's what Rachel was before she came to us. Very diverse, a lot of different fields and so on. She worked after her master's degree for the US EPA for 4 years. On watersheds, water quality, and coastal ecosystems. You'll see those themes come through her work in Hawaii. She's also worked internationally at CNMI, Guinea, India, Ireland, Saipan, and Senegal, and during her thesis period in Hawaii and in Chagos. The area that she worked in the southwest Kona coast of the Big Island is an area that one of my students worked in when I was back at Duke. And what she did was study ocean experts in that region. And we started out with, of course, the PhD scientists and the native Hawaiians, but quickly found that there are a lot of people who know the deep history of that. Ask them for their insights. And Jana Shakarov talked to 600 ocean experts along that coastline for a dissertation in 2008. We mentioned Greg Asner. Sorry, Greg couldn't be here. He was supposed to do this introduction, so I'm stepping in kind of at the last minute. But when she started working with Greg's group and laid out her plan, I thought it was really ambitious, and it really took full advantage of all the work that had gone on with high resolution data that he had acquired. Rachel's also unique in the sense that she's as comfortable in scuba gear as she is behind the computer. And most people are good at one of those things, but not in both of those things. And so she has both the field skills and the modeling chops to carry out the kind of research that you're going to talk about, she's going to talk about here. So I'm not going to take any more of Rachel's time, but it's really been a joy to work with her, and I'm going to enjoy her talk.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, you guys. And can everybody hear me okay? It's all good? Greg? Okay, so welcome everybody to my dissertation defense. As Jim said, it is entitled Climate Resilience in the Coastal Zone. And today we'll be talking about coral survival and regrowth under climate change in the Hawaiian archipelago. But before we get into that, I want to start with a question for you guys. You know, get off easy. How many of you, and raise your hand, have ever lived within 1 mile of the coast at any point in your lives? A lot of you. Okay. How about less than 50 miles? A few more. So most of us, I think, for that second question, and that makes sense. We're a pretty California crowd here. But either way, we're not alone. About 60% of the world's major cities are located coast, and about 40% of the world's population is coastal. And so these areas where the land meets the ocean are geographically pretty narrow, and yet they contain a huge portion of the world's population. So they're really busy places. And from the perspective of marine organisms, coastal ecosystems are unusual for a few different ways, First of all, they contain a lot of people, like we said, and with people comes pollution, sometimes dredging for construction, fishing, and many other activities, many negative, but some positive. Coastal ecosystems also get a lot of freshwater input, and this can come from either the surface or the groundwater. And with freshwater, that also brings pollution, but can also alter salinity and temperature and nutrients at the coast. There are organisms and habitats that exist along the coast that simply don't exist elsewhere. And for example, mangrove forests are important nurseries for marine fishes, and they also alter ocean chemistry nearby. There's a lot of lead to erosion, but also thermal mixing and particle exchange and other benefits. So for these and many other reasons, there is a lot of variation in coastal habitats, and this affects marine organisms, especially one organism that we'll be talking about a lot today, and that is corals. So corals are not as common here in coastal California. However, they are foundation species for marine ecosystems across the tropics. And corals today are in crisis. That is because corals kind of live and die by this single-celled algae that lives called symbiodinium. This algae actually gives corals their color. And it also conducts photosynthesis and gives food products to the coral host, which in return gives nutrients to the algae. So it's this great symbiosis. However, during heat waves, which are more and more common under climate change, corals will expel their algae into the surrounding ocean. And when this happens, the coral will turn bright white, so it's called coral bleaching, and they're unable to photosynthesize or gain products from photosynthesis. So eventually, if they last too long in this state, they will die. At global patterns in coral bleaching, they're pretty dire. Most coral reefs are expected to experience this to some extent in the next several years. However, if you look at a local level, there's a lot of variation from reef to reef in terms of how corals are responding to heat stress. And so in October of 2018, basically the first month of my PhD, I came across this study led by Brock Woodson and Fio here and some others. And this is not about coral reefs at all. It's actually about kelp forests in Baja. But it contains the following. Climate scale variability manifests differently in nearshore regions, creating marine microclimates that may provide a natural refuge from large-scale climate effects. And then later, environmental variation at the scale of kilometers could provide refuge from climate stressors. So I began to wonder how these various conditions that create so much heterogeneity at the coast could provide a natural refuge to corals from climate stress. This dissertation addresses 3 forms of coastal connections that can help coral change. In my first 2 chapters, I'll talk about how sediment runoff from the land affects coral reefs, and in particular, how sediment affected coral bleaching during a heat wave in Hawaii in 2019. Next, I'll talk about the interaction between reefs and other reefs. Corals reproduce by creating coral larvae, which are kind of analogous to the seeds of trees. And these larvae can float for over 100 kilometers before settling down into new habitat. So I will look at how habitat differences in the coastal zone coral larvae settle and grow into new colonies. And then finally, I'll look at the effect of the ocean on the land. So coral reefs also generate economic services that benefit human communities at the coast. And these services might motivate coastal businesses to invest in corals as an economic asset. So this is kind of my human take on microclimates, where I look at local conditions that enable humans to invest in coral stewardship. Now, there are many different types of coastal resilience, both negatively and positively. And I just focused on 3 here, but I focus on 3 that correspond to 3 different directions. First, the effect of the land on the ocean, then the effect of the ocean on the ocean, and finally the ocean on the land. And if you ever get lost in this talk, just look at this circle in the upper right, and that can help you find your place. But this was very deliberate. I think often when we research the ocean, we tend to focus mostly on this one, how humans are affecting the reefs, and it's almost always negative these days. So the policy recommendation in this case is to simply stop harming the reef in some detailed or nuanced way. But it's still, while reasonable, while that policy recommendation is reasonable, it's often difficult to prioritize and politically can be impractical. And so I hope that by highlighting the cyclical feedbacks between land and sea here, we can identify policies that are wins for both reefs and people. But I'm going to start with the usual suspect, and that is how humans are affecting the reef. And so 1 and 2 of my dissertation, I look at how land use, and in particular how sediment runoff, affects coral bleaching. So sediment looks like this. This happens when rainfall on the land mobilizes mud and dirt and causes it to run off into the reef in these big muddy plumes. And sediment is typically considered a form of reef pollution because it's pretty obvious. It can smother corals, it can abrade coral tissues, inhibit reproduction, it can introduce diseases and other harms. Climate change, more and more people are observing what they're calling turbid refugia. And so first of all, turbidity is a word that means the cloudiness or the muddiness of the water. Basically, the more sediment in the water there is, the more turbid it is. And so what are turbid refugia? These are places where people are observing lower coral bleaching inside of sedimented areas and more coral bleaching in clear water. So there are a few possible reasons why this could be happening. First is that sediment serves as kind of a sunshade for corals. And during corals are harmed by not only too much heat, but also too much sunlight. It's called irradiance. And so one possibility is that sediment is basically scattering the light and preventing excessive sunlight from coming down and harming the coral. So we can see this in, for example, this reef is off of Cartagena, Colombia, and this big major city in Colombia generates a ton of sewage and dumping and other nasty stuff. But lying below this layer of muck is a coral reef that seems to be surviving heat waves pretty well. And so one that the sediment here is scattering the sunlight and preventing too much of it from reaching the coral. Another possibility is that sediment might be introducing prey items to corals. So like we said, corals primarily feed from photosynthesis, but they can also feed directly on particles in the water column. And this is called heterotrophy. Some coral species do this more than others. So sediment might be in some cases introducing prey items to corals that help offset carbon losses from photosynthesis. However, research is still undecided on this. There are where we see higher bleaching under sedimentation. And so turbid refugia are controversial or at least inconsistent. And so this might be due to differences in context. If you have a few different case studies, say, and one study is looking at a reef in Indonesia, another study is looking at a reef in Singapore, these studies might look at different coral species and types of sediment which differ in their responses and effects. And so to understand if turbidity is generally protective, we need to look at broad patterns across large geographic areas encompassing multiple coral species and multiple types of sediment. So to meet this challenge, I called upon a new type of data from the company Planet, which provides satellite imagery of the Earth every day at 4-meter spatial resolution. And in 2020, I was fortunate enough to work with a team at ASU led by Jiwei Li, which developed an algorithm for processing planet data into a turbidity map. And I used these data to answer the following questions. First, of turbidity on coral bleaching at large, that is regional or archipelago scales. And then how does this effect of turbidity vary with different types of land use? So the first thing that we did is we generated a turbidity map for my study region, the Hawaiian Islands. And this is an example from Maui. So the dark purples here show lower turbidity. The yellows are higher turbidity. And then I classified turbidity by different types of land use based on US Census data. And in 2019, there was a large-scale bleaching event throughout the Hawaiian Islands. And this happened to coincide with my first summer of fieldwork in Hawaii. During the event, there was a large interagency group called the Hawaii Coral Bleaching Collaborative that conducted thousands of bleaching surveys throughout the islands. And so I ran our turbidity algorithm for the dates of the bleaching event, and then compared turbidity with bleaching at 1,024 sites across 5 islands. And I won't go too far into my analysis. It's called a Bayesian hierarchical spatial model, where the spatial here means that I accounted for spatial autocorrelation. And I defined coral bleaching by 2 different definitions. First was bleaching occurrence, which took on a value of, it was a binary variable, and it had a value of 0 if there was no bleaching on the survey, and 1 if there was at least some bleaching on the survey. And then also I defined it as bleaching severity, which was a continuous 1 to 100% coral bleaching. And here are some results. So the variables that I tested are on those variables that were influential in my model are starred on the right. And then here are results for bleaching occurrence and bleaching severity. And I know there's a lot going on here. It's a busy screen. So I'm going to unpack this. This first variable, SST, sea surface temperature anomaly, that means heat stress. So we found that this was positively linked and influential in bleaching occurrence, which makes sense. More heat means more bleaching. We also found that turbidity was negatively linked to bleaching severity. So as turbidity went up, bleaching severity went down, consistent with the turbid refugia idea. However, the interaction between heat stress and turbidity was positive, which means that even though turbidity did seem to be protective overall, as heat stress increased, this effect went away. So we can see this in graphical form. The left panel shows observations under low heat stress. The right panel is observations under high heat stress. Turbidity is on the x-axis in both cases, and the y-axis is bleaching severity. And then the different colors here correspond for rural and blue for urban. So in the left panel under low heat stress, we see that as turbidity goes up, bleaching severity goes down, and this is consistent across both types of land use. But this effect flattens out and even reverses in rural areas as we move to the high heat stress. So overall, we find that turbidity seems to be protective overall, but this effect is mitigated as heat stress increases, and especially in rural areas. So why this result of slightly more protection in urban areas? It's right? To look for one possible explanation, we can look at these reefs in places like Cartagena. So corals that live in urban areas are often, in ecology terms, seen as marginal reefs. And these are corals that kind of exist at the margins of what is possible for a living organism. These are corals that have managed to cling on despite decades of punishing conditions from sewage and dumping and dredging and who knows what else. And so those corals that manage to at the edges of existence might just be more stress tolerant, either in terms of their species or intraspecific traits. Also, rural turbidity is no joke. These places often have less infrastructure to contain runoff and control sewage, and sometimes they have finer soil types that are most abrasive to coral tissues. And during COVID-19, there's been a major wave of residents coming from the mainland to Hawaii, people kind of hoping to have their cake and eat it too, work remotely from a tropical paradise. And this is encouraging a construction boom that actually started before, but is going for the past, I'm sure, decade and especially recently. And so this might be leading to a lot of new runoff. And if corals in rural areas are not stress adapted like their urban counterparts, this new runoff or new development could actually be the most dangerous. And so policy recommendations in this case include strict containment measures to prevent runoff from construction sites, especially during risky times of the year like the rainy season. Also, construction in Hawaii should be planned strategically to minimize impacts on the reef, perhaps by considering approaches from the urban planning community like low impact development. And coastal managers can use planet data on turbidity to identify pore points of sediment that are most problematic or dangerous for the reef. And these data are publicly available through a new tool called the Allen Coral Atlas. And you can find sediment data even down to the facility level, because as I said, planet data is 4-meter spatial resolution. Also, there are new efforts in Hawaii where people are growing corals in nurseries to have heat-tolerant traits and then outplanting them into the wild. And we see from turbid refugia that heterotrophy could be beneficial during heat stress. So this might be something to build into future restoration efforts. Okay, so in chapters 1 and 2, we just looked at one certain definition of coral resilience, and that is how well adult corals respond to heat stress, or how well they survive during heat. Another way to look at coral resilience is the ability of corals, or how quickly they regrow after heat stress. And so in chapter 3 of my dissertation, I will look at the flow of coral larvae between reefs and habitat conditions that promote coral regrowth. But before I get into that in detail, I want to start with a backstory of this chapter, and that is that during the COVID-19 pandemic, I lived for 2 years in a community called Milili'i in the southwest of Hawaii. And Milili'i is quite famous throughout the state and, in fact, the world, because throughout the crazy waves of development pressure and globalization that Hawaii has experienced over the last decades and centuries, Milili'i has worked really hard to maintain its indigenous culture and fishing practices. And it shows. The ecosystem in this area is relatively pristine. There's some debate over whether anything is pristine these days, but the ecosystem is doing well. There's really low algae, high fish stocks, and high coral cover throughout the region. And so in 2022, earlier this year, Milili'i became the island's first CBSFA. This is a community-based subsistence fishing area, basically a community-led marine sanctuary, where the state has authorized Milili'i to manage its own fishery based on customary practices. And so this was a very momentous, landmark event. This is Governor Ige, the governor of Hawaii, in Milili'i next to Uncle Willie Kaupiko, the mayor of Milili'i, and the rest of the community, and it was quite. And so to situate us, we're here in the Hawaiian Islands, and in particular the Big Island in the lower left here. And there's a red box around Milili'i, this is here. And these different colored boxes up and down the coast represent different management zones in the CBSFA. And it covers about 30 kilometers of coastline here in the southwest. And so the community in Milili'i knows a lot about their corals and a lot about their fish, but one thing that they wanted to learn more about was coral keiki. And keiki means where in this 30-kilometer stretch of coastline is new coral growth occurring, and when corals reproduce, where do the keiki go? To ask this question, we have to look closer at how corals reproduce. Most corals in Hawaii reproduce by what's called broadcast spawning. And this is where different colonies send out eggs and sperm into the water during these synchronous events that are timed with phases of the moon. They're really beautiful. And in the water, they combine to form coral larvae, which can float for over 100 days before they settle down into new habitat, although they usually quickly. And so to define terms for a second, I will be using the term coral recruitment a lot. And so recruitment is basically a process where the larvae chooses a habitat to settle and then grows into a new colony. So one benefit of me living in Hawaii was that I got to spend a ton of time on the reef. I spent hundreds of hours swimming around the reefs of the area with different people, and I noticed how the reef here comes in many different shapes and sizes. So I became curious about how of the sea floor affects coral recruitment patterns. And this is because the 3D shape of the ocean floor really matters when it comes to coral ecology. There's a lot of work on this concept of rugosity, and that is basically the complexity of the reef. If you consider this ideal profile of a reef and this yellow line, which traces all the contours of that reef, and then the red line, which is the distance as a crow flies, the rugosity is the ratio of the yellow line to the red line. So it basically captures the number. And if you have more twists and turns in a reef, this creates shelter for corals from predators, and also shelter for small fish from their predators. These small fish in turn graze down algae that is the main competitor with corals. And so there's a lot of work on the benefits of rugosity, but very little research that connects rugosity and coral morphology to coral recruitment in the field. Those studies that do exist tend to focus at really small scale, so how small divots in the reef form shelter for larvae. But it's unclear whether coral morphology matters most at this scale, or the scale of a colony, or indeed a reefscape. And this matters because if we can typify the shape of a reef that facilitates coral recruitment, we can better identify these reefs to protect in the future. For the first time, we also have new technology that enables us to measure coral reef morphology at a near complete continuum of scales. And so in the lab that I belong to, the Asner lab, we do this in a few ways, shown here. One is SFM, or structure from motion photogrammetry. I know that's a big phrase, but basically what it means is there's a diver who takes hundreds of photos of the seafloor, sometimes thousands, stitches them together using a software into a mosaic of photos, or kind of a quilt of photos. And this turns into a 3D reconstruction of the seafloor, digital reconstruction. So from this, we can pull out morphology metrics at scales ranging from 1 centimeter up to 1 meter or above. And then we hand the ball off to aircraft. So Greg's lab also maintains an airborne observatory, which measures live coral cover and reef morphology at scales of 1 meter, or sometimes even less, that can aggregate up to 30 meters or above. Then we can hand the ball off to satellites, but I just use these two techniques in my study. So here's what those data look like. The upper right here are reef rugosity maps at 2 meter and 6 meter pixel sizes. And so the yellow areas are more complex reefs. The blue areas are less complex, simpler reefs. And I lived right over there. The lower image here is an elevation map of a reef generated from SFM at 1 centimeter pixel size. So I used these data to answer these questions. What is the effect of reef morphology on coral recruitment in millilii? And at what scales does morphology matter most? And then how does the effect of reef morphology and other variables differ across coral genera? I have some very interesting patterns on that one, but today's talk in the interest of time. So step one, the first thing I wanted to do was answer millilii's question most directly. Where did the keiki go? So I first measured coral keiki in the field, and I did so using a technique called settlement tiles. These are basically glorified bathroom tiles. We try to be fancy in science, but this isn't it. So limestone tiles that we planted out on the reef, and then coral larvae settled there like they do the rest of the ocean floor. And then we took them the reproductive season and exposed the coral skeletons and counted them under the microscope. And so I installed 320 tiles at 32 sites with 10 tiles per site. And I then used SFM and remote sensing to measure 4 different metrics of coral reef morphology, rugosity, curvature, slope, and fractal dimension. And I measured these at resolutions from 1 centimeter to 6 meters in moving windows ranging from 10 meters to 54 meters. These metrics are, but basically, if you think about yourself as a human body, as your shape, the way that you describe your shape, you can't really find one catch-all metric that describes your entire shape. You might use height or weight or shoe size or something else, but we need a few different metrics to describe ourselves. And similarly with reefs, we need a few different metrics to describe the shape of a reef. There isn't one catch-all metric. However, with all of these metrics and all of these scales, I had way too many variables for my model, so I had to shrink down these variables into just 3. And I used a technique called principal component analysis to do that. And that gave me 3 variables that captured most of the variation in my original 13. My first variable, PC1, principal component 1, was a mix of everything. Second variable was mostly fine scale morphology, so reef curvature, slope, and complexity measured at 1 centimeter to 32 centimeters by SFM. And then my third variable, PC3, morphology, reef complexity and curvature measured at 2 meters and 6 meters by aircraft. Big, chunky stuff. So I wasn't done yet, though. I had to consider some other variables that might dictate coral recruitment at all of my sites, and there were some big ones. So the first was just how many larvae there were available to settle at all of my sites. And this depends on the number of adults, the number of parents nearby, but also depends on the number of expected to come from elsewhere from the flow of ocean current. And so this next part is going to go a little bit fast, so just bear with me. I'll recap at the end. Basically, it's very difficult to measure coral larvae in the field, and so I decided to instead run a simulation. And the way I did this is I first estimated the relative number of larvae that I expected to originate at each point up and down the Hawaiian coastline. To do so, I started with a live coral cover map from aircraft remote sensing, and that's here in number 2. So this shows live coral region. The dark purples are about 70 to 80% coral cover, and the yellows are, say, I think 0 to 20% coral cover. And so then from each pixel in this map, I plucked up a number of larvae that was proportional to the coral cover in that pixel. So those pixels with 13% got 13 larvae, with 89% coral cover got 89 larvae, etc. This gave me a continuous cloud of about 12.5 million larvae up and down the Hawaiian coastline. And so this was born. I then overlaid this cloud with ocean current data that changed every day, And these data allowed me to recalculate the position of each of my larvae every 6 hours for 30 days. I then digitally connected the consecutive points for each larvae into a continuous flow path, and that's here in 4, and I counted the number of paths intercepting each of my tile sites. So I know that's a mouthful, but we got through it. Basically what I did to recap is that I used a simulation for the relative number of larvae that I expected to come to each of my sites from elsewhere. But I wasn't done yet. Never done. I had a few other variables here, and one was, like I said, the number of adults nearby, number of parents. And that came from SFM plots. I measured depth in the field. I measured fish density from a parallel data set, and embayment was just a binary whether or not my site was inside a bay. I then input all of these variables into a model that coral recruitment, both in terms of total numbers and numbers per genus. And so here are some results. These are heat maps or density maps of coral recruits throughout the CBSFA region. The red areas are more dense areas for recruitment. And this leftmost image is all coral species. Second to left is Poecilopora. Second to right is Parietes. And rightmost is Montipora. And you can see that there are a few differences between genera. Poecilopora is more concentrated in the northern areas of the CBSFA. Is a little bit more in the middle and southern areas, at least relative to other genera. And then Montipora are pretty sparse throughout, but they're highly concentrated in 2 areas called the Pakuikui Rest Area and Kapua Bay. And these are the main variables that came out as significant in my model for total recruitment. Overall, my variables explained about 72% of recruitment in the region, so that was pretty high. And this central image shows coarse morphology. So again, this is curvature and complexity measured at 2 meters and 6 meters by aircraft. So big chunky stuff, particularly large coral colonies or big volcanic boulders or big reef knolls, basically just large blocks in the reef. And as this big chunky stuff increased, coral recruitment went up. This was our most important variable for explaining coral recruitment. One possible explanation comes from this paper called Hata et al. In 2017. And these authors found that small obstructions in a current generated turbulence that was necessary for coral larvae to settle out of a current. And this is because they found that even though we know that coral larvae can swim, they're very weak swimmers relative to the other overall current velocity. And so they need these structures to generate turbulence in order for them to settle. So if you think about a big volcanic boulder in a reef, for example, there will be eddies and turbulence in the lee of this boulder that help coral settle out of the main flow. You might be also familiar with it if you've ever looked at a rock in a river and seen an eddy form behind it, or even if you've gone long distance cycling and drafted behind another cyclist. For you, it makes for an easier ride, and for corals, it just helps them settle out. And because we found that coarse morphology was so important in our model, we decided to rerun the model with just remote sensing used for measuring morphology. So scrubbing out all this SFM stuff, can we just use remotely sensed morphology to have a similar? And we found that this version of the model explained 61% of coral recruitment. So a slight reduction in performance from 72 to 61%. However, remote sensing is much more scalable than taking hundreds of photos in the water, thousands. And so this technology can be useful in the future for identifying high recruiting reefs. There are a few more variables that were significant here. One was the number of adult corals nearby. So this makes sense. More parents equals more babies. We also found that fish were negatively linked to coral recruitment, which was quite unusual. But fish have kind of a complicated relationship to coral recruitment. So fish are typically seen as some of the best protectors or defenders of reef health. And this is because fish chomp on algae that is some of the main competitors with corals. It's especially dangerous during bleaching events. However, while the fish are down there kind of munching along, they're also dislodging coral recruits, which are very fragile, so prey directly on corals. And so, as we said, Miloli'i is relatively pristine. It has really low algae throughout the system. And so it could be the case that algae isn't a big threat here, and the main signal that we're getting in this case from fish is from predation. This doesn't mean that fish are bad for recruitment. It just means that Miloli'i is doing a good job of keeping its ecosystem in check and its algae down. And this is really important for the future as development increases in the region, which might bring more runoff and sewage and nutrients for algae. And we really need to keep that algae at bay. So overall, to answer Middle question, we're finding most coral keiki in the northern CBSFA, but there's a lot of variation between genera. And our model explained about 72% of coral recruitment in the region. And we also found that coarse morphology matters a lot, which is actually good news for Hawaii, because in Hawaii, the rugosity comes from live coral, but also from volcanic substrate. Like we know from Greg's situation, volcanoes are very, and so it's a big feature of the reef. And so this volcanic substrate, this coarse morphology, could help corals recruit in the future, especially if, for example, restoration sites are established up current of volcanic boulder fields or other areas with coarse morphology, so that the future generations of those outplants have a higher chance of recruiting in the future. Another recommendation is to keep nutrients down and fish stocks up, and the middle of the East is a really good step in this regard. So now we're going to switch gears one last time and talk about yet a third element of coral resilience, and that is us. Basically, drivers that motivate human communities to protect coral reefs. So in chapter 4, the last chapter in my dissertation, I looked at the economic services that coral reefs provide to coastal businesses and methods of convincing these businesses to pay for coral reefs. So first of all, what do I mean by services? Basically the same thing that we mean when we say the phrase goods and services. So we're familiar with services in our everyday life when we pay somebody to change our oil or deliver a pizza. In a similar way, corals provide economic services to coastal businesses. And one big one is that they draw in tourists. So to wake you guys up a bit, I'm going to have you guys shout out some numbers. How much money do you think coral reefs take in for Hawaii every year, just in terms of coral reef-related tourism? Almost. 300 million. You guys are good. So $300 million, and this is based on a 2004 study, so it might be a little dated, but it's still a lot of money. Also, corals reduce infrastructure damage during large storms. A recent study showed that having a coral reef nearby can reduce wave energy during large storms. And I won't have you guess here, but this amounts to about $344 million of direct damages to buildings saved by having a coral reef nearby. And when you consider the cost of disrupted business activity from a flooded, closed building, then this amounts to $492 million per year in indirect damages saved for Hawaii. A lot of money. So a few years ago, there was a community in Mexico that realized this value that coral reefs provide and decided, this is Quintana Roo, Mexico, this is where Cancun is located, and the hotels and resorts in this area decided to pool money together to create the world's first coral insurance policy. And the way this works is basically just like I would insure my car or a house. This policy pays out a certain amount of money if a disaster happens to the reef. And so in 2021, Hurricane Delta came through and caused some damage. And so the policy paid out $800,000 to fund reef repair, stabilizing broken colonies, planting new corals, and getting debris off the reef. Based on the high payout of this program, the Nature Conservancy, an NGO that was involved in this work, teamed up with the Bank of America to lead a feasibility assessment of coral insurance in a few other places, Hawaii and Florida. And they ruled out Florida because the reefs there are basically too degraded to insure. But they landed on Hawaii as a good possible place for coral insurance in the future. And so I worked together with the Stanford Business School, Joanna Klitsky, to evaluate options for coral insurance in Hawaii. And we started with this guide called How to Insure a Natural Asset. This is published by the Nature Conservancy, and it takes you through a few guiding questions to consider when starting up a coral insurance policy. And one kind of linchpin question, one foundation question in the guide was this question: are there stakeholders who even value the natural asset? I mean, certainly there are communities, certainly individuals who value coral, but are there coastal businesses who recognize that corals are part of their revenue and are willing to invest in something like an insurance policy? So Joanna and I asked first, at a basic level, how valuable are coral reefs to businesses in Hawaii from their perspective? And does this vary with the level of ecosystem services? If there's a reef that provides a ton of storm protection and is really useful in a certain place, do the businesses in that area view it as such or not really? And also business. We might expect a dive or a snorkel company to attach higher economic value to the reef, but Joanna and I wanted to test this assumption. At an even more basic level, a business is not likely to insure a reef that it doesn't think is there, right? So we wanted to ask how healthy the reefs are according to these businesses. If a reef is degrading in a certain area, do coastal businesses there have a close pulse on that degradation, or not really? And also, does this vary with the type of business as before? Finally, down to the nuts and bolts of coral insurance, we asked what types of businesses are most likely to pay for coral insurance. Because again, if we can typify the kinds of companies that might be early adopters for a program like this, then we can identify places where these programs might work in the future, and also where other private sector-facing programs in restoration might work. So to answer these questions, we did a survey of 202 coastal businesses, and these 202 businesses represented 262 separate locations, because multiple businesses had separate locations, had several locations, I'm sorry. And they also represented 52 unique ocean operating locations. So these were places where businesses would bring out tourists onto the reef to go see an ocean spot. And so we started by piloting our survey in Maui, it out and make sure that our language was accessible, our questions were understandable to the public, and that we were operationalizing our variables correctly. And then we rolled out the full 202 on Oahu and on the Big Island. And we talked to many different types of companies, dive and snorkel companies, retailers, restaurants, lodging, surf shops, water sports, you name it, basically anybody under the umbrella of coastal tourism. And we started by asking them to rank the health of the coral reef where they operated. 1 to 5, how healthy is the reef? And then we compared their ratings to maps of live coral cover from aircraft in the same location where they operated. And these maps were rescaled from 1 to 5. We then asked these businesses we asked them questions about how valuable the coral reef was economically to their business. Questions like, if more of the reef died, I think I would have fewer customers, and other questions related to the flood protection benefits of coral reefs. And compared their response to external data sets on the ecosystem services of reefs. For example, this is the Mapping Ocean Wealth data set from the Nature Conservancy, and this quantifies the tourism dollars brought in by coral reefs in different points of Oahu. We asked them questions about different attitudes on the reef, as well as questions about demographic characteristics of the business owners and business traits like the size of the business, revenue stream, number of employees, and whether they were headquartered on or off island. And then finally, we asked them about their willingness to pay for coral insurance at 3 different payment levels, ranging from 1/8 of 1% of annual revenue to 1/2 of 1%. So here are some results. These graphs show business perception of coral health. And this blue bar are businesses in the lowest 20th percentile of coral cover based on remote sensing. So businesses that were operating reef. The dark blue are businesses in the highest 20th percentile of coral cover based on remote sensing. So businesses located near a ton of reef, or at least relative to the rest of the island. The thing to keep an eye out for is these brackets on the top. So I used a technique called bootstrapping to generate confidence intervals. And if these brackets overlap, that means that there was no statistically significant difference between their perceptions. So this means that the perception of coral health was not significantly different between businesses located near virtually no coral cover compared to a lot of it. This was also true if we looked only at businesses that work directly on the reef, like dive and snorkel companies. No significant difference between perception of coral health between businesses in a lot of reef or a little reef. We also asked these businesses to rate customer satisfaction in the ocean. And so how happy are your customers when they get out of the water with what they saw? And uniformly across the board, all of these businesses rated that as extreme reef was alive or dead. The same was the case even if it was on-reef businesses like dive and snorkel operators. Similar results with coral value here. So again, we chunked up the businesses into the lowest 20th percentile and highest 20th percentile of coral value based on those external data sets like Mapping Ocean Wealth. The brackets here overlap, and so there was no significant difference between perceived value of the reef in companies and coral value. However, there are some differences between industries here. So this leftmost bar shows what I'm calling recreation subsurface. That is diving as contrasted with surface, which is like surf and kayak and water sports. And dive and snorkel companies rated coral value as significantly higher than other industries, but not surface. So this difference when you just go from the surface to the subsurface was memorably illustrated by this quote from a surf shop on a dead reef. So it doesn't give us any more value whether it's alive or dead, or business at least. We also found a few traits that were linked to willingness to pay for coral insurance. So the big one, the most important one was this variable that we called pro-nature or stewardship ethic. This was basically an index that measured how important the reef was to respondents just in and of itself, regardless of all this economic material value stuff. How protect just because it's a natural wonder, it's good for the island, and in and of itself, it's a good thing to protect. People who responded highly on this index were much more willing to pay for coral insurance. And this might seem like an obvious one, but it's useful to know that even if a business isn't totally convinced of the material value of the reef, they might still be willing to protect it because it's the right thing to do. A few other traits we found as significant here. The first was seniority. Seniority is of years with the company and control over budget decisions. And so as seniority went up, willingness to pay for coral insurance went down. You can see this, these different multicolored boxes are different payment levels. So these are responses of, no, I'm not willing to pay anything for coral insurance, up to yes at the highest level. The blue gets darker as seniority goes up, so you can see that the darkest blue share goes down as payment level goes up. And this makes sense. You know, if you've been with a company for a longer time, have a vested interest in its future, you might be more risk averse, kind of want to see how a program like this that's fairly new settles out before you invest. Finally, we found that Native Hawaiian ethnicity was positively linked to willingness to participate. So this blue up here is Native Hawaiian respondents, and their share increases as payment level goes up. And this also makes sense. Corals are incredibly important in Hawaiian culture. However, I want to note here that even if Hawaiian businesses are willing to pay for coral restoration, that doesn't mean that they should be asked to do so. A lot of the damages to the reefs in Hawaii are due to the effects of colonization, and so colonized people shouldn't be asked to pay for the damages of colonization. Overall, we found that businesses rate coral value as fairly moderate, an average of 3 on a scale of 1 to 5. And we found that they rated customer satisfaction as very high, regardless of who was alive or dead. This all suggests that our ability to find people to insure a reef or pay for reef restoration isn't necessarily linked to the quality of the reef itself. Even if there's high coral cover and high ecosystem services, the businesses in that area might not perceive it as such. We also found few significant differences between industries in terms of their perception of coral health and value. However, we did find that many people were willing to pay for coral insurance based on other things like ethical concerns. I didn't mention this one, but businesses that were interested in cultivating a green reputation were also much more likely to participate. And we also found that Hawaiian ethnicity and seniority were positively and negatively linked to willingness to pay. So all of this suggests that the material value of coral reefs isn't necessarily a salient motivator in business decisions, at least not yet. And so this points to a need for more communication surrounding ecosystem services in these businesses, as well for these programs to consider these short-term motivators like the ethics of protecting a reef and like the ability to build a reputation. I asked people who weren't willing to participate why not, and many people spoke about a lack of trust. You know, they've seen a lot of initiatives come and go, and they're kind of sick of the parade, a bit jaded, and they haven't worked in the past, and so why would I spend my money this way? And that perspective makes sense. I think it points to the need for programs like this to really work from the ground up to partner with community groups that are trusted in the community on track record. Also, there are ethical implications with engaging the private sector. For example, in no event should a big multinational resort that pays a lot for reef restoration be seen as owning that reef or having a disproportionate share over decisions concerning it. And there are other ethical implications here to navigate as well. So to wrap up what we learned today, we started by asking, does coastal sediment protect reefs during bleaching events? And we found that turbidity was, but that this effect seems to go away as heat stress increases, especially in rural areas. Does larval flow from elsewhere help reefs regrow? This depends heavily on local habitat conditions, especially coarse morphology. And then finally, can ecosystem services motivate reef restoration? Maybe not, or at least not yet. There needs to be more communication surrounding ecosystem services and catering to these short-term motivators for their investment. And so to wrap up, there's a connection here that I didn't touch on today, and this is a tricky one. It's the connection between land and land. How do we connect people who are beneficiaries of reef services to people who are polluting the reef in order to come up with mutually beneficial solutions? I know that's an enticing topic, and I don't address it today, so it's kind of mean. And it's really tricky. I want to plug a paper that is coming out in PNAS this week that talks about federal policies that might be applied further to control runoff on the reef. But most want to emphasize that the leadership in this space is occurring at a local level, led by Native Hawaiian community groups that have long recognized the linkages between land and sea and have social networks that span multiple ecosystems. So the CBSFAs are a really good first step, but as much authority should be restored and support as possible should be given to these groups in the future. And with that, I will thank many, many, many people. I'm sure I missed somebody, so don't hate me, but many people who have helped me with. I have more extended acknowledgements later, but for now, I will take any questions.
But first, is there anyone in the room who has a question they want to ask Rachel?
Amazing. Hawaii has such a deep culture that is so connected with the preservation of their land. I know it's outside of what you were talking about here, but do you think it has a super positive effect on this? And do we see this kind of, do you see that similar cultural effect perhaps on other reefs in that place?
So to answer your second question, that certainly has an effect on other reefs across the world. I think originally in sort of environmental policy, there was this sort of state-based regulation approach, and more people are realizing that that doesn't work quite so well, and that people who were there in the first place and had indigenous systems that were very well attuned to land-sea connectivity, for example, were kind of doing it right from the beginning. And so there's been a huge move in sort of throughout the world to do things like CBSFAs, because not only are they the right thing to do, but they also make ecological sense and cultural sense. And so CBSFA-like mechanisms are happening in other places like Fiji and Palau, I know. And so I think this is definitely the way forward.
Okay, so I have a question here.
I was wondering if the results from the recruitment experiment went back to the communities and if that how much their knowledge of
I'm really glad you asked that. I think it's important to ask in any of these defenses. I have a call planned on December 15th. I don't know how the volcano affected that, but I worked with a few different groups in Milili'i. One was a nonprofit called Pa'apono Milili'i, and many of those people participated in a group called Makai Watch, which is kind of like neighborhood watch. Makai means, and so I have a presentation that I'm giving to Makai Watch on December 15th about this work, and I also plan to integrate it into kind of public-facing materials in the future. And, yeah.
So I have an online question from Rachel Mason. A good talk. Two questions. Why do corals expel their algae when the water temperature rises? Is it like taking off a blanket to keep cool? And a second question. How sensitive are your results in part 2 to the quadroke accuracy of your larval import simulations?
Can you repeat that second one?
How sensitive are your results in part 2 to the quality stroke accuracy of your larval import simulations?
Rachel Mason with the good questions. To answer the first one, there's still a little bit of debate, and I think it's kind of difficult to run experiments on this, but the latest working knowledge I know about is that algae, when they are heat stressed or sunlight stressed, generate these toxic oxygen radicals that make it expensive for the coral to host the algae. So as a short-term solution, they expel them, and eventually they can regain them after they've bleached and recover, unless the heat stress continues for too long. The second one, so the model for total recruitment that I showed, the larval import variable with the simulation, that didn't end in that model. So I think that if maybe it was more sensitive to nearshore hydrodynamic processes, it might have been more significant there. And I have a few reasons for thinking that, but it was important in models for two genera, Montipora and Parietes. And so it certainly wasn't perfect. There, as with any hydrodynamic data that we have access to, coarse, and so it had a 1 kilometer spatial resolution, meaning that there were certain kind of cropped off points along the coast. And so I think that if we had higher resolution data in the future, that could certainly improve things. But we were kind of heartened by the fact that the patterns in larval import from the simulations made general sense. We know that in this area, the direction of the current is southerly. It's 80% southerly flow, and it just goes straight down until Kauna Point, this point in the southwest that just shoots off. And so we found that larval import did aggregate steadily as we moved south. And that should make sense based on our knowledge of ocean current and based on some short-term empirical tests that we did using these things called drifter buoys, which are like big beach balls with telemetry that you put in the water and they drift along as if they're a coral larvae. But that is something that we like.
Two more questions here. Are there other questions in the room? Okay, so while this is more a comment, Sherry Comerford, please tell Rachel her former colleagues in source water protection at EPA are so incredibly thankful.
Wow. Oh my God. I had no idea how they got the link.
So, sorry, Justin, I forgot the mic. So then, Tricia Sharon, which of the recent reef restoration measures you mentioned are likely preserving coral health?
Ooh, okay. So I am not a reef restoration expert, and I know that there are some issues with scalability in reef restoration, that outplanting can be fairly successful, but figuring out how to scale it into enough reef that it would make a difference ecologically is something that needs to be kind of hacked. And so there is part of the Asner lab is working on different restoration options right now, but based on some really good knowledge from elsewhere in the world, and so I think there is a lot to be seen in terms of restoration solutions. And so I talked about two different types of restoration in this presentation. There's what's called active restoration, where you grow these corals in nurseries to have heat-tolerant traits and then outplant them. And then there's passive restoration, which is just strategically planning marine reserves so that these corridors of, for example. And I guess something that is relevant to my talk here today is that since we found that coarse morphology is so important for recruitment, this could be a pointer to future restoration efforts that use artificial reefs to add more coarse morphology to those artificial reef structures.
Okay, we'll make this the last question and then you can go into your closing. Kelly Hanjula, it's actually 3 questions. Great job, Rachel. Can you, what kind of payments the insurance policy would cover? For example, would this type of monetization support an offset program for expected damages from development? And do you see any potential moral hazard implications? There you go.
Yeah, so the pilot and first of all, I will caveat this by saying that these programs are very new. We had basically one successful pilot in Mexico that provided the example for hopefully many future efforts around the world. That case was based on hurricane damage. So basically the insurance payout was triggered by wind speeds of 100 miles per hour. And when the wind speeds reach this level, then the payout is triggered. And so the repairs sort of allowed in this case were those that related to hurricane damage, like is there a bunch of debris on the reef? Are there broken colonies? And then maybe down the line planting new corals, but mostly short-term responses. There are programs that are considering things like sediment runoff during large storms as triggers for payouts, or even water temperatures during bleaching events as triggers for payouts. But I think the payout, the rules in those cases are a little bit trickier because sources of sediment geographic distances, which would make payout kind of massive. So there are a lot of details in the payout mechanisms to work out here in terms of coral insurance specifically. I think in this study, we were just interested mostly in who among the private sector would be early adopters of restoration initiatives, generally speaking, with this kind of case example of coral insurance. And if we find enough people that might be interested where this is scalable, then we need to work out those details of payment.
One more question online. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So, Dominica Harrison, hope that's right. Do you see the new sediment product in the Allen Coral Atlas being used to identify the potential for the sediment refugia, or do the rural, urban, and thermal heat wave variables make this a little too complicated?
So that's a good question. I think there are a lot of possible ingredients to refugia or a refuge in any given area, and so you do need a lot of local data to contextualize that. And you also need some form of response variable, right? Like this depends on finding places where you have bleaching observations or not. So I think it is a few steps away from using this tool to say, yes, that is a turbid refuge and that isn't. But I think it allows us to identify places where the conditions might be ripe for this kind of refuge or not. In the future, what I would like to do in the land use side of things is, we just considered rural and urban land use, for example, and it really needs to be more granular than that. Those were broad strokes, right? There's a lot of different types of rural, a lot of different types of urban, and so to further kind of forecast places that might be refuges in the future, we need to get more granular with some of these analyses.
As you all know, we now go into, Rachel goes into a closed session with the committee for the rest of her defense, assuming that all goes well. There will be a reception at 2:30 on the second floor terrace here in Y2E2. And with that, let me turn over to Rachel.
Great. Oops, I'm gonna skip past my, hang on. I've got a lot of backup slides, Garth. Okay, here we go. All right, so I am an E-IPER student, as you know, but I also am at Hopkins, and as such, I have inherited two different traditions when it comes to acknowledgements. I think E-IPER students, if I'm not wrong, tend to be a little more brief, but I'm not going to be that. Hopkins students do this whole slideshow, and so that's what I'm going to opt for. It'll be 10 minutes, so please bear with me. First, I would getting tongue-tied already. I would like to thank people who have traveled long distances to be here today. People have traveled across oceans to be here, and it's just mind-blowing to me. First, thank you to Greg and Robin for making the trip out from Hawaii. We know how that ended up, and I'm sorry I can't see you, but I'm glad you guys are all safe, and I hope things are going well there. And thank you so much for making the trip. Thank you, Dylan, and this is my older brother, and Dylan's wife, Margaret, and child, Zoe, for traveling from DC. That is no mean feat with a 1.5-year-old, and it means so much that you're here. And then thank you to my parents who drove here from Washington. In terms of my PhD, I would first like to thank the village of Miloli'i. This is where I lived for most of my PhD, and I'm so grateful to Miloli'i for welcoming me to your home, for allowing me to learn from your land, and for sharing so much of your knowledge and stories and even meals. And thank you especially to Uncle Willie and Kaime Kaupiko, Lei and Lila Kaupu, and Will May Hui Hui for your friendship and support in many. Thank you to Greg. Greg Asner is my co-lead advisor. I think I've been sort of figuring out how to acknowledge Greg in my defense for the past 2 years in my head. But now that I'm here, it would take probably about 5 hours to say everything, so I can't. But Greg was not only my PhD advisor, but He was a close neighbor and friend during the pandemic. We lived down the street from each other and wouldn't have wanted to do the pandemic any other way. Greg offered me every form of imaginable support during my PhD, from boats and people to do my field work to countless movie nights and meals and IPAs. And Greg taught me how to dive, he taught me how to do science, and it's been very formative. So thank you, Greg. Thank you to Larry. Larry Crowder is my other co-lead advisor. And I remember my first phone call ever with Larry. I was so nervous. This was when I went to E-IPER. I was in an empty conference room at EPA, pacing kind of like I'm doing now. And I was just so nervous to get on the phone with him. And the minute he got on the other end of the phone, he was just so down to earth and so disarmingly humble and immediately put me at ease, and he always does so, always makes me feel more confident in my work. And he's just the best combination of a cheerleader and a constructive critic. And so thank you so much for everything, Larry. Thank you, Theo. This is my favorite photo. I think it should be like your professional headshot. I had the great benefit of being in the field with Theo in the Chagos Archipelago for 5 weeks last year. And the first, I think probably half of that trip, it just poured rain the entire time. Just everything was wet all the time. And whenever I looked over at Theo, she just looked so incredibly happy. And she was this beacon of positivity. And she's the kind of scientist I hope to be a fraction of one day. And so thank you for being that role model. Gretchen. Gretchen Daly has been part of my committee for about a year, and she's worked with me on the coral insurance stuff for about 2 years. And there are many, many impressive things about Gretchen. But one thing that I've really appreciated as a student is she gives really good feedback. Like, she has this amazing ability to give feedback that is very direct and straightforward, straight to the point, but also very kind and encouraging. And I think that's a really hard thing to balance, but she does it perfectly, and it's a really lovely thing to experience as a student. So thank you. Thank you to Jim Leap, my committee chair. Jim, I think, is the most frequent chair for our program. He probably does about half of them these days. And he's so good at it, so we keep asking him. And no good deed goes unpunished. But I asked Jim because I basically wanted an excuse to talk with Jim about the ocean, and it worked. So thank you, Jim, for your expert facilitation and great insights over the years. There are two people who are not officially on my committee, but they might as well should be. This is Robin Martin. Is a killer scientist who just happens to be married to Greg. So I got this great 2-for-1 deal in my advisement. And this is Robin with a birthday cake that she baked me one year in the shape of a settlement tile. Just next level. Robin is one of those people that seems to have the energy of 10 people, and she's just a total powerhouse, awesome to behold. And so thank you for always being such an inspiration, Robin, and for always setting a third plate at the table for me. Shauna Fu in Greg's lab, and she is one of my closest collaborators and one of my closest friends. We call each other our science wives, and we have great plans to skip off into the sunset and join labs together for life. And so I look forward to that future with you, Shauna. Thank you to the E-IPER staff, past and present. If E-IPER is a happy family, these guys are the parents of about 40 children. And we come to them with everything ranging from a problem with our email address to an existential crisis. There's no problem too big or too small for these guys, and they are the heart and soul of our program. So thank you for all you do. Thank you to many students who have helped me over the years in many ways, especially Trisha, Niles, Kylie, and Anella. You guys are amazing, and I can't wait to see what you do next. Thank you to many people who have helped me in the field over the years, far too many to name, but a special thanks to Neil Hugenboom, who really helped the rubber meet the road when it came to my settlement tile work this year and last. Thank you to my lab groups, the groups of the Asner lab and the Crowder lab. This is them in reality. You guys are geniuses, simply put, and I am a mere mortal walking among you, so thank you for having me. Thank you to my PhD cohort. You guys are some of my best friends, and I didn't expect that coming into this program. It's been a huge gift, and I don't know if I could have done this program without you, so thank you. Thank you to many friends who have kept me safe. And speaking of sanity, thank you to Ben. Ben is my partner. We met about 2 years into my program. I think it's really hard to date PhD students. We're kind of like a pain in the ass. But Ben has been steadily there for me. for sure kept me focused, never distracted me when I was writing my dissertation, just silent as a tomb in our house. And Ben visited me in Hawaii. Here's him having a lot of fun on a hike that I dragged him on. Thank you to Dylan. Dylan was my first guide to the natural world. Speaking of volcanoes, this is us in Hawaii, I think maybe circa early 2000s, just kind of always following in his footsteps. Dylan learned to dive during my PhD. He flew from DC to Florida to get certified and then joined me in Monterey to explore the kelp forests and see some sardines. And thank you to Margaret, his wife, and Zoe, my niece, for many forms of support over the years. Thank you to the little people in my life for reminding me to approach the reef with the childlike curiosity it deserves, and especially Zoe, my niece, who at 1.5 years is already an ocean baby. She's going to do great things. Thank you to my grandmother, who's here. She is a steady, just constant source of inspiration and the strongest person I know. And then finally, this dissertation is dedicated to my parents, Jim and Ronnie Carlson. They have been giving me the tools to get a PhD since day one, including literal tools. They came to Hawaii to visit me and ended up building settlement. So thank you guys for everything you do, and I love you a lot. That's it. I'll see you at 2:30.